Melissa White worked as a busy real estate agent in downtown Chicago. Her days were filled with client meetings, property viewings, and endless paperwork. However, the busyness of her work was also an excuse to escape from her complicated family relationships. On the surface, Melissa maintained a good relationship with her parents, Robert and Judith. She called them, visited on holidays, and sent gifts on birthdays, fulfilling the role of a good daughter that social norms demanded. But beneath that peaceful appearance lay years of tension and unresolved conflicts. Robert was a retired high school teacher, outwardly a mild-mannered and intellectual man. He always called Melissa, "my little scholar," and praised her academic success. However, when it came to important family decisions, Robert always gave in to his wife Judith's strong opinions. He justified himself as a peace-loving person, but to Melissa, her father's attitude often seemed like mere weakness. Judith had worked as a clerk at a local bank but after early retirement became active in the neighborhood social scene. She was a perfectionist who placed the highest importance on the family's appearances. While she proudly boasted about her daughter's success to friends, she constantly threw critical comments at Melissa herself. "Are you meeting important clients dressed like that? Still not married in your 30s? Your apartment could be bigger, you can surely afford it." And Melissa's brother, Greg, was financially dependent on their parents and lived just a few blocks away from their suburban home. He worked as a salesman at a local car dealership, where his performance was mediocre. But in Judith and Robert's eyes, Greg was the perfect son. He would show up at his parents' house on weekends, compliment his mother's cooking, nod to his father's opinions, and cleverly drop comments that belittled his sister. The family tensions deepened 10 years ago, after the death of Melissa's grandfather Harold. Harold had been very fond of Melissa. He greatly appreciated his granddaughter's curious nature and independent spirit. Ironically, these weren't the only qualities Melissa had inherited from her grandfather. According to Harold's will, a significant portion of his assets should have been directly inherited by Melissa. Melissa had only recently learned this fact. By chance, she met her grandfather's old friend and former legal advisor during a real estate transaction. The elderly lawyer mentioned, with surprise, how little inheritance Melissa had received. "Harold intended to leave you much more," he said with a puzzled expression. Subsequent investigation revealed that her parents and Greg had collaborated to alter the will, significantly reducing Melissa's share. She was left with only a fraction of what she should have received. This discovery left a deep wound in Melissa's heart. She wavered between anger and feelings of betrayal. However, having always learned to control her emotions, she was careful not to let her family know that she was aware of this fact. Instead, she collected evidence and prepared for a future confrontation. Meanwhile, Robert's 70th birthday was approaching. Judith planned a commemorative family trip and booked a week in Hawaii. "Your father has always wanted to go to Hawaii," Judith explained to Melissa over the phone. "You'll come too, won't you? It wouldn't be a family trip without you." Melissa struggled to adjust her work schedule but eventually agreed to join. Judith took care of all the travel arrangements. 2 weeks before departure, she emailed Melissa the details of the departing flight from JFK Airport. "I'll go with everyone," Melissa promised herself. She intended to confront her parents and brother during their stay in Hawaii. The airport was, as usual, bustling with activity. Travelers lined up at check-in counters, families rejoiced in reunions, and businessmen hurried to boarding gates. Amidst this commotion, Melissa looked up at the departure board searching for her flight to Honolulu. "Honolulu. Honolulu." Melissa whispered as she scanned the timetable. But the flight number she was looking for wasn't there. Anxiety crept into her heart. Heading to the information counter, Melissa asked the female airline employee, "Excuse me, could you tell me about Flight 1422 to Honolulu?" The employee smiled kindly and checked her computer. Flight 1422. Just a moment. Her smile slowly faded. I'm sorry, but there is no flight 1422 from JFK to Honolulu today. There must be some mistake. Melissa showed the employee her smartphone displaying the email she had received from her mother. It says right here. JFK, Flight 1422, departing at 2:15 p.m. The employee checked her computer again and shook her head. That flight number is for a flight from LAX. Los Angeles International Airport, not JFK. The color drained from Melissa's face. She took a deep breath trying to calm herself. Could you please check the reservation under my family's name? White, Robert and Judith, plus Greg and Melissa. After searching, the employee shook her head apologetically. The White family reservation is on the flight from LAX, not from JFK. Melissa stepped away from the counter and, feeling her hands trembling, called her mother. After several rings, she heard Judith's voice. Mom, I'm at JFK Airport. Where is everyone? Melissa raised her voice slightly to drown out the surrounding noise. On the other end of the line, a moment of silence. Then came her mother's laughter. Light and bouncy, but unnatural. Oh, Melissa. It's LAX, not JFK. We're already on the plane heading to Hawaii. Judith's voice was cheerful, but underneath lurked something cold. Melissa was confused and angry. But you said in your email it was JFK. Did I? That must have been my mistake. What a shame. Her mother's voice had a false sympathy mixed in. But don't worry. You can book the next flight and just be a little late. Melissa stood still amidst the airport bustle. While people rushed past her, she alone seemed frozen in time. Finally, she headed to a nearby cafe and sank into a window seat. Melissa double-checked the email from her mother. Scrolling through the screen, it clearly stated, JFK International Airport, Terminal 4, departing at 2:15 p.m. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. She had been deliberately given wrong information. Next, she called her brother. Hey, Greg, what's going on? Mom seems to have given me the wrong airport. After a brief silence, Greg's low, slightly mocking laugh came through. Messed up again? Just like always. What do you mean? Nothing. Just that you always get something wrong. Forgetting important dates, being late for appointments. Isn't this just more of the same? But Mom's email said, enough. We've already boarded. Do whatever you want, but don't ruin our vacation. The call ended. Melissa stared at her coffee, mulling over her brother's words. Just like always, those words stung her heart. This wasn't the first time. Since childhood, she had always been subtly excluded from important family events. Being told the wrong time for family photos, forgotten birthday celebrations, plans changed at the last minute. Her grip on the cup tightened. This wasn't a coincidence. It was another calculated action to exclude her. Looking at a nearby flight information monitor, she saw that the next flights to Hawaii were fully booked for the next 2 days. Waves of anger and humiliation washed over her. And suddenly, clear lucidity filled her mind. She had finally seen through the nature of her family relationships. They didn't love her. They saw her as an obstacle and were trying to exclude her. After hours of contemplation on an airport bench, Melissa made a decision. It was time to take action. She left JFK Airport and headed to her apartment by taxi. In her mind, she was already planning her next move. Reaching her apartment, Melissa pulled out a thick file she had kept deep in her study. It contained evidence she had collected over the years, copies of the altered documents relating to her grandfather's estate, records of illicit financial transactions between her parents and Greg, and a journal of numerous incidents that had mentally cornered her. She began to calmly formulate a plan. No more running away or ignoring. While her parents and Greg were enjoying their family vacation in Hawaii, she would take action to reclaim her life. A week later, on a Saturday afternoon, Chicago was bathed in warm early summer sunshine. A taxi stopped in front of Robert, Judith, and Greg's home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The three of them, tanned and relaxed, got out of the car and picked up their suitcases. "Ah, it's good to be home," Robert said, taking a deep breath. "Hawaii was wonderful, but nothing beats sleeping in your own bed." Judith lovingly stroked her husband's arm. "It was a wonderful birthday celebration. It's a shame Melissa couldn't make it, but she always prioritizes her own schedule." Greg snorted. "Well, we had plenty of fun without her." Robert headed to the entrance and turned the key. The door opened, and the three entered. However, they were greeted by an unfamiliar sight. "What in the world?" Judith's voice trailed off. The living room was nearly empty. The high-end antique furniture, paintings, and decorations that the family had cherished for years, most of them were gone. All that remained was basic furniture, a simple sofa, dining table, and a few chairs. "My jewelry." "Robert. My jewelry is gone." Judith rushed upstairs and screamed. Her jewelry box was empty. On the living room table lay a note. Robert picked it up and read it aloud. "Welcome home. From Melissa." A moment of silence dominated the entire house. Next came an explosion of anger and confusion. "I'm calling the police." Judith picked up the phone with trembling hands. "That girl has gone crazy. This is theft." An hour later, 2 police officers were investigating their home. They took notes politely and looked around the house. Finally, the older officer faced the family. "I'm sorry, but this appears to be a civil matter. According to the note Ms. Melissa White left, she only disposed of items for which she has legally established ownership." "What?" Judith's face reddened. "Those things are ours. They were in our house." The officer apologetically explained, "She has submitted detailed legal documentation. Many of these items appear to have been directly transferred to her from her grandfather decades ago. Additionally, according to the documents she submitted, some items were funded and purchased by her." "That's a lie," Robert shouted. The officer shrugged. "That would be difficult to prove, especially given the mountain of legal paperwork and receipts she has submitted. If you wish to pursue this matter, I recommend consulting an attorney." After the officers left, the family sat in the living room in a state of shock. Greg suddenly stood up and took out his cell phone. "I'm calling her," he said through gritted teeth. Melissa answered on the first ring. "Hello, Greg. How was Hawaii?" Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "What have you done?" "Give everything back," Greg shouted. On the other end of the phone, Melissa sat deep in her chair. Her new apartment was bright and spacious, decorated with the high-end furniture she had taken from her parents' house. "Give back? What?" "Everything you stole. Mom's jewelry, Dad's watch collection, furniture, paintings, everything." "Stole?" Melissa laughed gently. "I didn't steal anything. Everything I took is legally mine." "Liar." "Well, think of it this way." Melissa's voice remained calm but grew sharper. "Will you return my inheritance? The portion you took from me by altering my grandfather's will, with 10 years of interest. And then calculate the value of family trips, events, and opportunities from which I was excluded. On the other end of the phone, Greg's breath stopped. What are you talking about? Ask your mother, and then your father. They both know. So do you. After a long silence, Greg said in a low voice, let's meet. Tomorrow. The following afternoon, Melissa waited for her parents and brother at a downtown family restaurant. She wore a stylish business suit and had placed a thick file of documents on the table. When her parents and brother appeared, Melissa stood up and calmly greeted them. Sit down, Judith said in a commanding tone. Her eyes burned with anger. You've gone mad. Melissa smiled. No, Mom. Rather, my eyes, which have been foggy for a long time, have finally awakened. She opened the file. This is a copy of Grandfather's real will. And the fake documents you created. What's interesting is that a female clerk at the law firm is prepared to admit that you bribed her to create false documents. Robert's face turned pale. Melissa, we're family. What happens between family? Family? Melissa laughed quietly. The family that told me the wrong airport? The family that left me behind knowing it was LAX, not JFK? That was just a misunderstanding, Robert said weakly. Don't lie, Melissa's voice grew stronger. I have saved the email from Mom. And my exchanges with Greg. I have all the evidence of your plan how to exclude Melissa from the trip. Greg squirmed in his chair. You stole. That's a fact. Melissa shook her head. The lawyers have a different opinion. I just reclaimed what was legally mine. In fact, the actions I took were completely legal and carried out under legal guidance. She pulled out more documents. These are evaluations from real estate and jewelry appraisers. The total value of the items I removed almost exactly matches the value of the inheritance my grandfather intended to leave me, including interest. The three were speechless. Finally, Judith squeezed out, What do you want from us? Melissa took a deep breath. You have two options. First, I can submit all the evidence to the police and prosecutors, and all of you will be charged with fraud and embezzlement. Altering my grandfather's will is a felony. She opened another section of the file. Second, you can agree to my terms. What terms? Robert asked in a hushed voice. First, pay the full amount of my inheritance plus interest, minus the value of the items I took. Second, written apologies from all of you. And finally, completely stop interfering in my life. The three exchanged glances. Greg started to speak, but Robert raised his hand to stop him. All right, Robert finally said. We accept your terms. Melissa closed the file and stood up. I'll send the paperwork through my lawyer within a week. She hung her bag on her shoulder and turned back as she left. And remember, I am no longer your family. As she left the restaurant, she felt as if a burden had lifted from her shoulders. After years of silence and endurance, she had finally reclaimed her voice. A month later, Melissa was enjoying her morning coffee in her new apartment on Chicago's North Side. From the spacious living room window, she could see the blue waters of Lake Michigan. The room was bright and open, with her grandfather's antique furniture tastefully arranged. On the walls hung the artwork she had taken from her parents' house, giving the room warmth and history. Negotiations with the lawyers had proceeded swiftly, and her parents had agreed to pay the remainder of her inheritance. With this additional funding and proceeds from items she had sold, Melissa had the capital to start her own real estate consulting company, something she had dreamed of for years. White Property Partners, though still small, was already beginning to attract attention. She focused on ethical business practices and a customer-first approach, bringing a fresh approach to the real estate industry. Melissa brought the coffee cup to her lips, thinking about the events of the past few weeks. Though she had acted out of anger and humiliation, she now felt a strange peace. She had regained control of her life. The sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Looking at the clock, it was still only 8 a.m. She wasn't expecting any visitors. Melissa headed to the entrance and opened the door. Her father, Robert White, was standing there. He looked even older than when he had returned from Hawaii, with slumped shoulders and deep lines of fatigue etched into his face. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying recently. "Melissa, I want to talk," he said in a weak voice. After a moment's hesitation, she widened the door. "Come in." Robert entered the living room and looked around at the furniture that had once been in his house. However, he didn't utter any words of accusation. Instead, he sat down on the sofa and folded his hands on his knees. "Would you like some coffee?" Melissa asked. "No, I'm fine," Robert answered. "I came here without telling my wife or son." Melissa sat in a chair opposite her father. She remembered the father of old. When she was little, he had been strong and dependable. The man sitting before her now was merely a shadow of that. "Tell me what happened that day at the airport," Melissa asked quietly. Robert stared at the floor for a long time. "Judith changed it before sending the email," he finally confessed. "She didn't tell me. I only realized when we arrived at LAX. When I asked, 'Where's Melissa?' Judith said, 'She's not coming.' Why didn't you call me?" Melissa's voice was calm, but underneath lay pain. "I should have," Robert hung his head. "But Judith said, Melissa has chosen her own path. She was always jealous of you. Your independence, your success, things she never had. She gave up her own career when she was young to marry me. She regrets that. You knew and didn't stop it. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact." "I was weak," Robert admitted. His voice trembled. "I always wanted to avoid making waves. I wanted to keep the peace. But in doing so, I hurt my own daughter." Silence spread between them. Melissa took a sip of coffee and gazed out the window at Lake Michigan. Gentle waves were lapping at the shore. "Tell me about Greg, too," she finally said. Robert heaved a deep sigh. "Greg is the same. He was terrified of your success. You were always better than him, in school, at work, in life. He was always trying to prove himself. But he didn't have your courage or determination." "And grandfather's inheritance?" Melissa asked. Her voice remained calm, but they both knew this was the most important question for her. "It was Judith's idea." Robert held his head. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. "When she learned that Harold was leaving you a large inheritance, she was furious." "Why only her?" she said. "I shouldn't have agreed. But I did. I signed the papers and helped bribe the lawyer." "But you agreed," Melissa said quietly. "I came to apologize. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just." Robert teared up. "I wanted you to know how sorry I am." For the first time in her life, Melissa felt like she was seeing her father's true self. The man she had always thought was strong and always right was, in reality, weak and flawed. Instead of feeling the anger she had anticipated at this revelation, she felt a strange sadness. "Dad, I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she chose her words carefully. "It might take time. But I recognize that you've acknowledged the truth. That's, maybe a beginning." Robert slowly stood up and took an envelope from his inner pocket. "I brought this," he said. Melissa opened the envelope and gasped at its contents. Inside was a check from his personal account and a small velvet box. Opening the box, a beautiful antique diamond ring sparkled. "This is your grandmother's wedding ring," Robert explained. "Harold intended to leave this to you, not to Judith." "I knew that. The check is from my personal savings. Judith doesn't know about this. It's yours." Melissa took the ring and held it up to the light. It was simple but beautiful, with a timeless elegance. In this small gem seemed to be packed a part of her past and future. She looked up at her father's face. In his eyes were mixed regret and hope. Melissa suddenly understood how empty her parents' marriage had become. They lived together and outwardly behaved as husband and wife, but in reality, there was only habit and dependency between them, rather than affection. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, but a sign of recognition. She acknowledged that her father was making an effort. Whether that would be enough to heal the wounds in her heart remained to be seen, but it was a beginning. Robert sat back down on the sofa. "I've decided to separate from Judith," he said quietly. "I think it's the right thing to do. She and we haven't been a real couple for a long time." Melissa couldn't hide her surprise. "Where will you go?" "A friend is lending me an apartment. It's small, but perfect for a new beginning." He smiled. It was weak, but a genuine smile. "I would like to see you occasionally. If that's all right with you." Melissa thought for a moment. Repairing her relationship with her father wouldn't be easy. After years of betrayal and disappointment, rebuilding trust would take time. But she also understood the futility of harboring anger forever. "Coffee sometimes," she finally answered. "Let's start slowly." Relief colored Robert's eyes. "I couldn't ask for more." "Thank you, Melissa." He stood up, preparing to leave. A year later in the fall, from Melissa's office window the Chicago skyline appeared golden. White Property Partners had grown rapidly, becoming one of the most reputable real estate consulting firms in Chicago. She had made her grandfather Harold's values, honesty and diligence, the guiding principles of her company. It wasn't just a business but an expression of her life philosophy. Melissa reached for the picture frame on her desk. It held an old photograph of her and her grandfather. Harold's gentle smile and wise eyes still gave her strength. "You were right, Grandpa," she whispered. "Thank you for teaching me the importance of following my own path." As for Judith and Greg, their ending was full of irony. After Melissa had taken the valuable items from their family home, Judith couldn't tell anyone what had happened in order to preserve her reputation in the neighborhood. She had to continue the lie of redecorating. Even more ironically, Greg lost his job due to the recession and was forced to move in with his parents, taking on full responsibility for their care in their old age. A few months ago, Greg unexpectedly visited Melissa's office to ask for employment at her company. Melissa calmly declined but referred him to another real estate company in the area. It was an act of mercy, but not complete forgiveness. Robert had formally separated from Judith and was living a quiet life in a small apartment. He and Melissa were gradually repairing their relationship. They had begun having dinner once a month. Sometimes they talked about the past, other times they simply discussed everyday events. The path to complete forgiveness was still long, but at least they had begun walking it. Melissa's desk phone rang. Her secretary informed her, "Your afternoon meeting is ready." Melissa responded, "Thank you, I'll be right there." Before standing up, she looked out the window for just a moment. In this beautiful autumn season with its colorful foliage, she couldn't help but think about the changes in her life. A year ago, she stood at the airport feeling betrayed. Now, she was leading her own business, living on her own terms. From her desk drawer, she pulled out an old family album. Occasionally, she looked through it, reflecting on the past. It contained photos of a seemingly happy family, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family trips. They weren't completely false, but they weren't completely true either. After gazing at the photos for a long time, she quietly closed the album. The past cannot be changed, but the future is in her hands. She stood up and picked up her coat. Before leaving the office, she looked out the window. The sun of a new beginning was shining through the clouds. I didn't miss my plane, she smiled. In fact, I've just taken off.